Good evening, folks. How we doing? I've actually made this video before, but I'm just doing a rework of it after getting it ready for a eucalyptus identification workshop. The first one that I ran for some consultants in New South Wales, ecological consultants, and I'll be running those workshops again in the future. And as promised, I wanted to make these notes available to you and to the wider public, really. But I just sort of reorganized the slides. I put a bit more in. The video is probably going to go for longer, but if you want a bit more information and you're enjoying them, then I'm happy to put a bit more in. I'll say again, I'm really trying to ramp up this content, and it just sort of comes in spurts, and then I get distracted with other projects. But yeah, just redoing this one, and then I'll aim to review the Angophora one and the Corymbia one and the Eucalyptus videos I haven't got completed yet. So I do have a fair bit of work to do, but I really want to keep engaging with whoever finds this sort of content valuable and interesting. And I'm certainly getting a lot of demand at the moment in New South Wales in 2024 to I guess, yeah, to teach, I guess primarily teach some younger people about botany and our main plant groups in Australia. So, yeah, covering this one, the Eucalypts, those really dominant and prolific trees in Australia. And currently at the moment, well, this will be debatable, but we're running with the previous sort of understanding where we've got Angophora, Corymbia and Eucalyptus, but I will touch on some recent changes as well. So diving right into it, what we kicked off with was the three genera that dominate forest and woodland areas within the Australian landscape. And they're very prominent plants and very interesting to a lot of botanists, even internationally. The diversity that we see amongst these three closely related genera that dominate a lot of Australia, a lot of Australian areas. Now, I haven't worked everywhere, and I haven't hardly done any work in the interior desert of Australia, but even in that area, in the middle of Australia, you're still getting eucalypts being part of the vegetation a lot of the time. We can have some extensive mulga shrublands, which are dominated by wattle or acacia, and maybe some chenopod shrublands and things like that. But if you're going to travel Australia far and wide, and you're going to observe the vegetation, you're going to observe eucalyptus most of the time, but if you're within, say, several hundred kilometers of the coast, you're going to observe Corymbia and Angophora a lot of the time as well. So they dominate our forest and woodland areas. They're canopy species, and what we sort of refer to is they form dry and wet sclerophyll forests and woodlands. Now that sclerophyll refers to a particular plant tissue type called sclerenchyma or sclerenchyma cells, which I won't sort of do justice to this, but going back to plant physiology at uni, it's sort of a toughened cellular material which makes the leaf generally very tough and sort of very durable. And I don't even know whether it's just unique to Australian plants. I wouldn't think it is, but it's definitely prominent in the eucalypts and some other genera in Australia. So we just refer to it as dry and wet sclerophyll. We've got these leaves that are sort of toughened, resistant to UV radiation, not overly palatable to animals, and definitely not really edible by us, and maybe give the plant a little bit more protection against fire and sort of things like that, although, you know, it seems that these trees do readily, you know, cope with fire. But in the interior areas, you can get mallee woodlands. That's where you've got eucalypts existing as sort of multi-stem shrubs. And we refer to those eucalypts as mallees. You can get some coastal mallees as well, but they are very prominent in the interior parts of Australia where, you know, there's just such low rainfall in those desert conditions. And There's also some other mallee types as well. There's what's that one from Western Australia? I think they're called mallards or something like that, where they're a mallee looking eucalypt, but they sort of only have one stem and might not have that lignotuber capability. But you've got forests, you've got woodlands where the trees get a bit smaller, and then you've got mallees and a whole heap of other ones as well, which we'll look into. Generally, they don't grow in rainforest, but they can grow right up to the edges. So look, where I do a lot of my work south of Sydney, we're basically restricted to what we'd call warm temperate rainforest in some deep, maybe, you know, sandstone gullies. You can get eucalypts growing right up to the edge, and even along creek lines where, you know, rainforest mid-story and ground layer species dominate, and you sort of get emergent eucalypts above that. But generally, if you're in genuine rainforest in Australia, you really shouldn't have eucalypts in it. They are thought to have evolved from ancient rainforest into drier environments. And one interesting thing, just been watching a documentary recently on Australian TV, it's called Earth, and I think it might be an English documentary, but it's absolutely fascinating. If you haven't seen it, a documentary called Earth, it's really good. What they talked about in that was, it really generally, Gondwana was breaking up, of course, but about 50 million years ago, Gondwana was basically rainforest, you know, tropical jungle, pretty much. We can think of it like that. And from 50 million to 30 million years ago, it's gone through an incredible drying up and cooling down process, where Australia has just become the predominantly desert landscape that it is now, and the rainforests have retreated into those refugia, like the Daintree and places like that. The guy on the show said they're still arguing over why that occurred, why we went from this 50 million year ago tropical jungle predominantly to this 30 million year ago desert, grasslands, arid Australia, and maybe some other parts of Gondwana that we know today. And it's quite interesting, but you would have to think that that period really benefited the eucalypts. And eucalypts have been around a lot longer. I think they go back 150 million years. But you'd have to think since 30 million years ago, or since 50 million years ago, is where they've really come into their own and diversified across the Australian landscape. And I think it's something that's still undergoing study. But we know Gondwana was well and truly breaking up at that point, well and truly broken up. And I think Australia and Antarctica and New Zealand were the last bits to break up about 40 million years ago. Very interestingly, there are fossils of eucalypts in New Zealand, but there's no extant species apart from the ones that have been planted, you know, in the last 200 years or whatever. But there's no naturally occurring species, although there is fossils in New Zealand. You know, it's really interesting. So yeah, it's an interesting story with these guys. They've certainly left the rainforest and adapted to the drier conditions. We know they're strongly adapted to fire, and most species are able to resprout from epicormic buds and lignotubers. Now, epicormic buds are these sort of buds that sit underneath the bark on the stems and the trunks, branches, and you'll see them reshooting after fire, sometimes as early as 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks after fire. The lignotuber, that is a swollen organ at the base of the trunk, and it's meant to be chock full of carbohydrate tissue and sugary tissue, and it's generally protected from even the most hottest of fires, although we are worried that the fires are getting more extreme and maybe trees can be killed. But by and large, those lignotubers are protected. They're swollen, full of sugary tissue that doesn't get burnt, and they readily resprout after a fire. I would say, from what I've read, about 90% or more of eucalypts have a lignotuber, and there's just a few that don't, or let's say up to 10% that don't. Those species that don't, that can't respond from epicormic buds or lignotubers, just like a whole heap of other plants that might be killed by fire, they've got to regenerate from seed, and we call that obligate seeders, where a plant has to regenerate or put out the next generation from seed. They've only got one choice, and that makes it obligatory. So the Australia's tallest tree species and the second tallest tree in the world, the Eucalyptus regnans, tallest flowering plant in the world behind the coast redwoods of America. They're obligate seeders. They don't have a lignotuber. So those beautiful trees that grow to 100 metres tall in Victoria and Tasmania, they regenerate from seed, and after fire, thousands of them come up in those areas after fire, and then they just compete with each other and thin each other out. And it's very interesting that they don't have a lignotuber, but they grow into such a big beastie. Generally, all these three genera are referred to as Eucalypts. You can apply that to all three of them, and we'll see in the next slide one of the reasons, or several reasons why, but they're closely related, they're a bit interchangeable, and research continues. And if you want to call them all Eucalypts, that's how we happily refer to them. In the last video, I threw this in at the end, but I've decided to throw it in now early on and just say, let's say, get it out of the way. But the reason I throw it in is because I'm recording this in June 2024, and this came out at the start of 2024, where we've had a new scientific publication, a major one, which has recognised a new genus called Blakella. And just trying to recall, it's named after a botanist called Blake. I think his name was Stanley Blake, I think, who did a lot of work on eucalypts in the 60s and 70s. Just don't confuse that with another botanist called William Blakely, I think, who was a bit earlier, 30s and 40s and maybe the 20s, who also worked on eucalypts and also had a eucalypt named after him, such as Eucalyptus blakeleyi. This is Stanley Blake, and it's named for him. And we've got, I think, mostly species of Corymbia being put into the genus Blakella, and it might become adopted in the future. And I think, I'd say botanists are in a stage now of looking at it and seeing if it's going to be recognised. So in case you didn't know, up to 1995, we just had Eucalyptus and Angophora. That's all we had. About, I assume the same number, about only 10 to 13 species in Angophora and about 1,000 in Eucalyptus. Let's just say that, maybe 800, something like that. In 1995, Ken Hill and Laurie Johnson, both of who are deceased now, put about 100 species or so into Corymbia, anywhere between 95 to 110, 115, depending on your lumping and your splitting. And that's what I've always learnt about since about since about the year 2000. Angophora, Corymbia, Eucalyptus, everything called a Corymbia used to be called a Eucalyptus species. So for example, Eucalyptus gymifera is now called Corymbia gymifera, but it will have a synonymous eucalyptus name. Dean Nicole is if I can say, a botanist from South Australia, regarded as one of the foremost experts on eucalyptus, and he totally deserves that title. I've met Dean once. I spent a day in the field with him back in 2013. He was helping us with a problem with identification in Western Sydney, but he's got an arboretum in South Australia, I think, where he's trying to grow every species known of eucalypts. So it gets a bit like that eucalyptus storybook. But Dean has put this out, I think it was on Facebook at the start of 2024, just telling us what the different sort of acceptances are, I guess, for eucalypts as they currently stand. And it just pays to know, the whole point of this slide is things are in a state of flux. They're a complicated group and they remain subject to scientific scrutiny, and botanists are trying to come up with, I guess, the most parsimonious or the most, you know, sensible way of recognizing these groups, and it gets a bit complicated. We have to remember that the genus Leptospermum, that's just been split up into 5 genera, including Leptospermum. So we had about 100 species of Leptospermum, and they've just been split up as well. We're going down to about 40 species left in Leptospermum. You've got a nice new genus called Gaudium with about 25 species in it. Agriflorum, Leptospermopsis, which I think is a resurrected genus, and I can't even remember the other one. I wrote an article on this for Australian Plant Society, but we've got to cope with that, and we've got to cope with these changes as well. But these are just the different scenarios that Dean gives us for how different botanists have treated the group through time and which one might be adopted. And we can sort of try and do this quickly so it makes sense. I've learned the Hill and Johnson system, and I'm pretty happy with that. But you know, I'm not a taxonomic botanist who studies these things. But the 3 genera, Angophora, Corymbia, Eucalyptus. This nightmare that botanists have, which keeps them awake at night, is this idea of monophyletic groups. So you've got all species being, if they're going to be recognised within a group, and a group might be Angophora or Eucalyptus, you only have the species that are descendant from the one common ancestor, and all of the species that are descended from that one common ancestor, if I've done justice to that. And the way it's currently recognised at the moment, people aren't happy with it because you got things like some species of Corymbia being more closely related to some species of Angophora than they are to other species of Corymbia, and when you look at the genetics and blah blah blah. So botanists just can't cope with this. It sort of keeps them awake at night, or taxonomists, you know, keeps them awake, and you know, that's their game. That's what they get into, and we've just got to try and get our heads around what the scientific, you know, sort of investigation is here. But if we stick with this, there'll be no taxonomic disruption, and all of us sort of like that. We don't have to cope with any new combinations and name changes. There is some difficulty in differentiating genera using field morphological characters. So I think it's sometimes a bit confusing identifying a Corymbia over a Eucalyptus, or maybe identifying a Corymbia versus an Angophora, maybe in some cases. Probability of future genus splitting, lumping and species shuffling is high. So people like Mr. Crisp here are going to keep investigating and making changes if we stick with this system, and he's basically already gone ahead and done it. The peer and wider community acceptance is currently very high. Some people still do not accept Corymbia. So when Hill and Johnson made this courageous change where they took about 100 Eucalyptus and put them in Corymbia, we had a fair bit of complaining about it. Where we say the wider community, what we've got to think about is people who work in the nursery industry, people who work in bush regen, people who work in horticulture, people who work in arboriculture. They're trying to explain to people that the plant that's for sale is Corymbia citriodora or Angophora costata, and then a botanist comes along and changes the names. And they've got to tell the general public that yes madam, yes sir, that tree used to be Angophora costata, but now it's called Blackella something else, just for an example, hypothetical. And a lot of people get really pooey and get the shits and sorry, I shouldn't say that, get annoyed. And it's an Australian video, you can cope with that. And in horticultural circles, people get very upset just because you got to go through a nursery and change plant labels, and you got to understand why the name's changed and all that sort of thing. And botanists are told these days to think about the amount of disruption that it's going to cause to the understanding of these plants. And it's something they've sort of got to consider, and they sort of get criticised if they don't consider it. But that's where all the peer review comes in. So let's have a look at what Mr. Crisp did. He's recognised Blackella in addition to Angophora, Corymbia and Eucalyptus. Monophyletic for now, but future research may find otherwise, and further genus splitting shuffling may be required. Okay. But it looks like Crisp and co have identified that Blacella is, if you take the species of, it looks like Corymbia here, and put them into Blacella, you've got some nice monophyletic groups based on whatever part of the DNA sequence they're looking at, I would assume, and some other characters as well. We've got some major taxonomic disruption. Part of Corymbia, 38 of 97 species, has been split off into the new genus Blacella. Well, I don't find that all that bad, really. If only 38 species of Corymbia have gone into Blacella, we've got to see that as a 1995 split from Eucalyptus, and then we've had another split into Blacella. So it's sort of these Eucalyptus species have gone into Corymbia, and then some of those again have gone into Blacella. I reckon I could cope with that okay. Extremely difficult to differentiate the 4 genera using field morphological characters, and Dean was saying it was already difficult with 3 genera. It's going to be even more difficult with 4. So what I imagine would be the case is these Corymbia species that have been put into Blacella, I guess we're going to have a hard time working out whether we've got a Corymbia species or a Blacella species. And I'm not cognizant of what the morphological differences are, but we'd have to have a look. Probability of future genus splitting, lumping and species shuffling is high, okay, and the peer and wider community acceptance is unknown, but is likely to be low, at least initially. So I guess it's that sort of thing where people complain about it initially, and then they just come to accept it as the years go on, once it sinks in, I guess. You can go with a guy called Ian Brooker. I believe Ian Brooker is deceased as well. He was a Eucalyptus expert. He's written some very helpful field guides. Ian Brooker, his idea was you just had one genus, Eucalyptus. Fantastic. We can all just go home. This is great. There's no Angophora, there's no Corymbia, and there's certainly no Blacella, although Brooker probably didn't know about that. There's one genus. You just put all the species into one genus. It's monophyletic because you've got all the species and you've just lumped them under this big group. And unless we find, this is really crazy, but unless we find in the future that something like turpentine, Syncarpia glomulifera, is a Eucalypt and shouldn't be a Syncarpia, we're fine. If someone found that, then Eucalyptus would be non-monophyletic because we've got to now include that turpentine into the mix. But until we find something like that, every single species that's recognised is all lumped under here, and we've got this beautiful, huge monophyletic group, and we can all sleep soundly. Major but precedented taxonomic disruption to incorporate all Angophora, all Corymbia back into Eucalyptus, but most of these combinations already exist. So few new combinations required. So what Dean's referring to there is Corymbia maculata has a placeholder name called Eucalyptus maculata, and it would just revert to that. However, the Angophoras, you'd have to find new names for them. They'd sort of get new names. Where I can explain that, if you're confused, is we have a beautiful tree in Sydney called Angophora costata. And what Brooke is saying is, Angophora costata should be called Eucalyptus costata, let's say. However, we already have Eucalyptus costata. We already have it. It's a tree that grows in the southwest of New South Wales and probably goes into South Australia and Victoria. I've never seen it, but someone has recognised a species called Eucalyptus costata. That would mean if Angophora was lumped into Eucalyptus, you can't call Angophora costata Eucalyptus costata because there's already a different species called that. Therefore, Angophora costata would have to be called something else. It can't be called Eucalyptus costata species 2 or species B. It can't be called that. It's got to be called Angophora, some sensible name, hopefully, for what we call our Sydney red gum or our smooth barked apple. So you got a little bit of problem there. But you got to remember all these Corymbias used to be recognised as Eucalyptus. So they've got placeholder names or synonymous names ready to go back into. No need to differentiate genera. Oh, beautiful. We can become really lazy. This is great. Probability of future genus lumping and species shuffling is almost nil. Peer and wider community acceptance may initially be low. So we've got to live with this approach that there's no such thing as Angophora and there's no such thing as Corymbia. Those names are going to fade into our memory as the years go on. And 20 years time we'll say, oh yeah, I remember Angophora. Yeah, that's gone now, hasn't it? So that was the idea of Brooker. Now you can have alternative A, which is the last one Dean gives us here. We have 3 genera, Angophora, Blacella and Eucalyptus. Holy dooly. Corymbia is gone. So this new thing, Corymbia, which has been recognised since 1995, is gone. Monophyletic, apparently, and major taxonomic disruption with part of Corymbia, 38 species, going into Blacella, and the rest of them going into Angophora. Holy dooly. So what Dean is saying there as a possibility is 59 species which used to be recognised as Eucalyptus have jumped into Corymbia and are now going to jump into Angophora. Oh, holy dooly. Well, that would mean that what I'm going to say in this presentation on how we split Angophora from Corymbia, that's not going to be a thing anymore. You know, what I'm saying is, we recognise Eucalyptus and Corymbia by that beautiful bud cap on the flowers, the calyptra, which Angophora doesn't have. But if these Corymbia get lumped into Angophora, I assume we're going to have Angophora species that have the bud cap, the distinctive Eucalyptus bud cap. So this is getting really complicated, and I'm going to battle with this one. Very difficult to differentiate genera using field morphological characters. Yeah, okay. Probability of future genus splitting and lumping and species shuffling is high, and the peer and wider community acceptance is likely to be low. Okay. Well, if you know, again, my point of this slide was to say that these are the possibilities. This is how the group could be treated. And whether we're going to run with CRISP or whether we're going to keep the status quo, which I'm comfortable with, or whether we're going to adopt Brooker or whether we're going to adopt alternative A. When we say we, I mean whatever the botanists are going to decide we do. And the point I make is I work in New South Wales and I'm loyal to my government institutions. I say this, I'm not loyal to my political parties, I'm loyal to government institutions. And the government institution, the New South Wales Herbarium, whatever they advise we should run with, that's what I adopt because I work in New South Wales. At the moment, we adopt this system, and that's what I run with in this presentation. But I'll keep my eye open and ear to the ground and all this sort of thing and see what happens with this one, and whether we're going to adopt it. What I will say is, I work in New South Wales. 38 Corymbia species are going to be transferred into Blacella. They probably don't even occur in New South Wales. I would assume they are tropical species up in Queensland and Northern Territory and maybe Western Australia. We've only got 12 Corymbia species in New South Wales. Maybe a couple of those will become Blacella. And it's not a lot for me to deal with personally, but if you work in tropical Queensland, you might find that a lot of your Corymbia have become Blacellas, and so you might just have to watch out for that and see which way the wind blows. But had to put that in. Just so you're aware, things are in a state of flux, nothing's concrete with this group, and the botanists keep, you might call it meddling, I call it investigating, and let's just see where we go. But that's what that slide there was all about, and I'm very grateful to Dean for putting that together and trying to summarise it all for us. So it just pays to remember we're in the family Myrtaceae. It's a major plant family in the Australian landscape. It's you know, at the family level, we go international. It's a worldwide family. Species occur from Malaysia to Australia, South America. I mean, I thought they got into Europe as well with the European myrtle and things like that. So it might be a bit further afield, but a massive family, an important family worldwide, 145 genera, about 5,700 species. So it's a predominant world family. In Australia, we've got about 70 genera, about 1,400 species. We do have a high amount of endemism when it comes to the species level. A lot of the genera don't just occur in Australia, but at the species level, we've got a high amount of endemism. Myrtaceae, named for the genus Myrtus, Myrtus communis. Yeah, that's a European myrtle, which I assume is native to Europe. Maybe it's not, but it's definitely got plenty of presence in the Northern Hemisphere. Anyway, so in Australia, if we just focus in on the Australian genera, plants with simple leaves in the Myrtaceae. I haven't met a Myrtaceae member that has compound leaves. They have simple leaves. And they can be arranged either oppositely or alternately. And we get, it's very important when we're looking at Eucalypts, as we'll see. Genera that have opposite leaves: Syzygium, Acmena, the lily pillies, Ostromyrtus, Tristania, and generally Angophora, one of the Eucalypt genera. And if they're alternate, we go into Leptospermum, Tristaniopsis, Eucalyptus, and Corymbia, which normally have really strong alternate leaves, and it's a really useful identification feature. Bisexual flowers in the Myrtaceae. We're not getting into that situation of male and female flowers only, or male and female plants only, producing, you know, either male flowers or female flowers, monoecious or dioecious. They're well and truly bisexual in the Myrtaceae, but pretty much without exception. 4 to 5 morous, so we might have 4 to 5 sepals and petals. Stamens in 5s, or might have 5 stamens to a flower, but they can be in 5s or they can be numerous. And it's one of the features of the Myrtaceae family, especially in Australia, is these conspicuously staminate flowers. It's just a really strong feature of the Myrtaceae. The flowers have one carpel, and the ovary can be anything from, you know, inferior to superior. Doesn't really help that much. But the common feature is the hypanthium. It's like this base receptacle of the flower. It's sort of a bit of a bowl that hold the reproductive parts and the sepals and the petals. And it's sort of really pronounced in the Myrtaceae, and it's pronounced in Eucalypts as well. So in a lot of genera, you hear about this term called the hypanthium, and I'll try and point that out in the photos. The Myrtaceae get split early on in, I think, across the whole family, but definitely in Australia anyway, on the dry fruit, and that's tribe Leptospermoides, or the fleshy fruit, tribe Myrtoides. So with the dry fruit, we get things like capsules in the Eucalypts, or nuts, which are not to be confused with gum nuts. These get called gum nuts, but they're actually capsules. A nut is a completely different type of fruit, where it's a genuine, small, dry sort of component, and it's nothing like this sort of capsule here, which has valves that open and the seeds come out. So look, people will call these gum nuts. I move away from that and call them capsules. And again, nuts are in things like Calatrix, which, you know, there's not a lot of woody material surrounding the seed. It's sort of a little bit I guess basic or reduced. You got a seed in there inside a bit of a shell, and readily germinates. So that's Leptospermum, which have capsules, the Eucalypts, Calatrix, which has a nut, and then you got your fleshy fruit in things like the lily pillies, Syzygium, Acmena, Ostromyrtus. A lot of the time they're edible, not really known to be poisonous in the Myrtaceae, but always exercise caution. Drupaceous, meaning they're more like a drupe, more like a peach or a plum or a small version of that, with a hard sort of seed inside. So they're the sort of two conditions with the fruit in Myrtaceae. Here's a flower of Angophora. Angophora flowers do have small petals and sepals. You can't really see them here. They're sort of reduced, but they're underneath all of the stamens here in this flower. So I say this, it's a bit of a scary situation. You've got one female part there, the carpel, surrounded by tens or hundreds of males. So these are all releasing pollen from the anthers, and the female part in the middle is ready to receive pollen, you know, probably from a different plant. So they don't want to self-fertilise, they're probably waiting for pollen from another plant. And you might find that these parts are releasing first and this part becomes receptive later, or vice versa. On these flower buds, you can see the sepals there. There's one, and there's one, and there's one there. Beautiful structures on this Angophora hispida. And you've got petals underneath there. They aren't really prominent in Angophora, but they are there. So that's your typical Myrtaceae flower. One carpel, many stamens, and your 5 morous sepals and petals. Just looking at some other genera. This is Tristaniopsis. 5 morous flowers. There's your 5 petals. There's 5 sepals there underneath. Nice yellow flowers in this genus. And what's really interesting here is the stamens are bundled into 5 claws, what we call staminal claws. And it's just another thing that the Myrtaceae throw up. Rather than having the stamens all free and just sitting around the hypanthium there, they're bundled into 5 claws. And Melaleuca does this as well. It's a prominent feature of Melaleuca a lot of the time. But you got a lot of stamens. They just tend to be grouped into 5 clusters, or 5 claws, if you like. And you might find in each cluster, or each staminal claw, there might be 10 or 15 or 20 stamens. Looks like there could be 10 there, maybe there's more. But it could go on a multiple of 5 a lot of the time. It's really cool. This is Kunzia capitata. Same thing. 5 petals, there's 5 sepals there underneath, and then when the flower opens, you got all of these stamens surrounding one carpel, the darker pink structure in the middle. Same thing going on, just variations on the one theme. Just it makes the Myrtaceae family, at least in Australia, readily identifiable a lot of the time. Here's a bottle brush that we all know and love. It's a similar thing going on. You've got 5 petals here down the bottom, and you've got 5 sepals as well. Sometimes the petals and the sepals can fall off, or one of the whorls falls off. And Melaleuca tend to do that as well. But each individual flower, remember that this is the inflorescence, the cluster of flowers, or the arrangement of flowers. And this is an individual flower. So you can sort of get your tweezers and you can pull off an individual flower. And then it has all these beautiful red stamens. When you look at a stamen, you've got the anthers up the top, which are releasing the pollen. And then you've got the stalk that holds the anthers, which is called the filament. And in this beautiful bottle brush, the filaments are just this beautiful bright red colour. Just absolutely stunning. There's the female part again, the carpel. That's so the stamens, the anthers are there releasing pollen on top of the filament. Together that makes the stamens. And then you got the female part. In the middle, smack bang in the middle of every flower is this female part, the carpel. One there, one there, one there, one there on every individual flower. And you've just got a whirl of stamens around. In callistemon is known for not having those stamens grouped into staminal claws like you saw in the Tristaniopsis, or Melaleuca for that matter. They're all free. They're all sort of free and just sitting around the flower there. That might be an insect there caught up in it. But they're just all nice and free. They might be slightly fused to the base. That's been one of the features of callistemon. And, you know, callistemon, the actual name from Greek means beautiful stamens. That's pretty much what it means, or beautiful flowers, even kallistemon. It just means beautiful flowers. And it's all to do with those stamens doing all the work. And the petals aren't all that showy. Leptospermum, it got said to me at a previous shrubs identification workshop that they're a bit different. They're sort of, the stamens aren't doing a lot in Leptospermum, and I totally agree with that. You can get 20 or 15 or so stamens, just they're really reduced here in sitting on the hypanthium. There's the 5 petals, sorry, 5 sepals. There's the 5 sepals, and there's the 5 petals. And the stamens are there, but they're just not doing much in Leptospermum. It's more of a true sort of myrtle, I guess, where they're not really doing a lot, but they are there, and it's a true myrtle, Leptospermums. And what normally tends to happen is the stamens are grouped opposite a petal, and they just tends to be a little bit of separation between the next group. And there's still the one female part in the middle, waiting there to be fertilized. There it is there. So I do acknowledge that. The Leptospermum, they're a little bit different. The stamens just aren't doing the same showy work, but they are there. 5 morous flower, 1 female part in the middle. And there's just some sketches here which do sort of highlight that hypanthium, that bowl of the flower. It's very pronounced in Leptospermum and a lot of the other genera. And this was work by Joy Thompson back in the day, one of Australia's probably foremost Leptospermum experts, just showing the difference sort of appearance in a lot of Leptospermum species. But that's sort of what we mean by the hypanthium, which is sort of housed in the ovary and will eventually, you know, still be there when the fruit are produced and the seeds are released. And you can see that term being referred to there. And if we move on to Corymbia, and here it is, same deal. This is a Corymbia gramifera, beautiful staminate flower, female part in the middle. And what happens in Eucalyptus and those species that became Corymbia, we have that distinctive bud cap. We have that bud cap that covers the flowers, and that can be thought of as a fusion of the petals or a fusion of the sepals, or both. Sometimes you have 2 bud caps. And when the flower opens, that bud cap is lost. It just falls to the ground. If you look at a flower in Eucalypt, look on the ground, and you can see a lot of bud caps, or what we call singular a calyptra, or an operculum, or plural is sort of calyptrae, or opercula, or bud caps. And that's sort of the petals and the sepals of the flower being thrown off. And you're left with the male parts, the stamens, and the female part in the middle. And it's what you can call an incomplete flower. It's sort of incomplete because some of the parts are missing or they've been lost. And that's a real strong feature of Eucalyptus and Corymbia, at least for now, as I understand it, going back to that earlier taxonomic shake-up that we looked at. But if we just go to the next slide, you can see that in play here. So here's our flower buds. These are our flower buds of a Eucalyptus. And that is the bud cap, or the opercula, or the operculum, sorry, or the calyptra. That's the hypanthium, that bit there. That's the bowl that's sort of supporting everything, and that's where the ovary is. And that bud cap will eventually be pushed off, or it just moves off and falls to the ground. And this is what happens after that. The flowers open. And you just look at all those beautiful stamens, and there's probably over 100 there. I don't know how many are there, maybe 200, something like that. And then there is 1 female part there in the middle, which you sort of got to look for. But it's smack bang in the middle there. Beautiful staminate flowers. And there's no petals, no sepals, because they've been lost as this fused sort of structure protecting the main parts of the flower. So that's your top bit, your bud cap, and then your hypanthium underneath, and that's really iconically Eucalyptus and Corymbia as well. And Angophora doesn't have this setup. It has genuine separate flower petals and sepals that open up and just stay there on the rim of the hypanthium. That's currently the difference we understand between Angophora and Corymbia and Eucalyptus. I'll just point this out in case anyone's confused, but look, every now and then you get a bit of interchangeability between these three sort of states, or at least these two states here. So someone might put a photo up on the New South Wales Facebook plant identification page and say, can someone help me identify this eucalypt? I've got really great photos of the flower buds. Or they might say the buds. And you feel like a bit of a narc, but you might comment, you've actually captured the capsules, not the flower buds. And only once someone has said to me, oh Dan, you've been really pedantic, tomato sort of thing. Well, no, I'm not being pedantic. We just got to remember, we go from this stage, the flower buds, the calyptra is lost, we go to the fully formed flowers, very beautiful, and then those flowers will get pollinated and the hypanthium will remain behind here and the fruit will develop, the capsules, or what some people might call the gum nuts. Just got to remember, that's the sequence. We've got flower buds, flowers, and fruit. And sometimes people will just refer to these as buds and they'll refer to these as fruit. And we can't be doing that. That's wrong. So just make sure you get that terminology right. I'm sure most people are on top of this. All I say with teaching plant identification to people and TAFE students for 10 years or thereabouts, it's just one of those repeated patterns that keeps occurring. Someone will just say, Dan, can you help me identify this eucalypt? These were the flower buds. And you just got to say, no, they're the fruit. You've got the fruit. It's these guys that release the seed. It's these guys that open up to reveal the flowers. And they sort of go together, and then we have these guys. And all we're waiting for here is for the seeds to pop out. So I'm sorry to overemphasize that, but just got to make sure we're referring to the same things here, or the right things there. So just wanted to point this out here. This is a common feature that you'll see. Here's some beautiful flower buds. There's the hypanthium. There's the calyptra. And when the species are described, sometimes they'll refer to the hypanthium and calyptra length. They'll say the calyptra is well and truly longer than the hypanthium. Or the calyptra and the hypanthium are equidistant, or the same length. Or the hypanthium is much longer than the calyptra, for example. You get that in Corymbia, which is normally pretty pronounced. But there's a beautiful photo of what we call in Eucalyptus an inflorescence, or a cluster of flowers, which can get referred to as an umbel, or what I think is more correct is an umbelaster. Now, an umbel, if you know your inflorescences and you get to learn how flowers are arranged on a lot of plants, and an umbel has its root, sort of shares the same root, or shares the same sort of linkage with umbrella, or a word like that, where you've got like a sort of lollipop of flowers, if you like, or a sort of raised head of flowers. One of the best examples is something like Agapanthus, if you know that beautiful plant. Or, you can see them in the carrot family as well, the Apiaceae, although they tend to have compound umbels. They sort of have groups of umbels. But it's where you've just got a raised sort of circular head of flowers. And Eucalypts are sort of putting up a similar thing, and some websites will refer to it as an umbel, and if you want to refer to it as an umbel, that's probably okay. This website, Euclid, the Eucalyptus ID website in Australia, they refer to them as umbels. But on New South Wales Flora Online and some other experts, they refer to them as umbellasters, because they're not really truly umbels. And I'm going to take the time here to explain what I got taught, because I think it's really cool, and to sort of explain why. In an umbel, you've sort of got flowers just being produced from the one point of origin. If you think of an agapanthus flower head, they sort of all developed all at the same time, and they all emerged, and they've just sort of emerged around this, I don't know, 180 degree radius, or 300, maybe moving towards a 360 degree radius if it's a full-on ball. And they've all sort of emerged from the one point of origin. These Eucalyptus umbellasters, they get referred to as condensed dicasia. And what a dicasial inflorescence is this sort of structure here, which I've mopped up really quickly to try and emphasize to you what exactly is going on, although it's a little bit confusing. When we look at a lot of eucalypts, they have their flower buds arranged in these constant numbers, and it's really cool mathematical stuff. I'm not sort of getting into a Fibonacci sequence or anything, but it's sort of this really cool repetition of mathematics in biology, which I think is really cool. Some eucalypts have 3 buds in the umbellaster, and some species can be identified readily by only having 3 buds. Then we jump to 7. And a lot of eucalypts have 7 buds in the umbellaster. And then we jump to anywhere between 7 to 15. So on a regular basis, you'll be getting maybe 11 or 13 or maybe 14 or up to 15 or maybe around 7. And I've just put there, some eucs have 7 to 15 and a lot of them have 11 to 15. And then you can jump to the next sort of category where you might have 15 to 31. And there's not too many that go up that high, and they can be identified very readily from that sort of thing as well a lot of the time. So what I've done there is just said we're going up by 4, and then we're going up by 8, and then we're going up by 16, and then we could go up by 32 and go up by 64, and eventually obviously there's a limit to what biology is going to sort of produce with its available resources and room to grow and all that sort of thing. But if we take a dicasial inflorescence in some plants, and it'd be really helpful of me to mention some examples, but I can't really think of any at the moment. You might have one growing point, one original growing point, and there might be a flower that sort of gets produced there. Then that one growing point stimulates or instigates the growth of 2 new points. And you might have a flower here and you might have a flower here. And in turn, those 2 new points instigate the growth of 2 new points. Like that. And as you can see, we've gone from 3 and now we move to 7. Because of this repeating pattern. And then if flowers number 4, 5, 6 and 7 produce 2 new flowers each, we go 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and we now jump up to 15. And if all of these flowers produced in turn 2 new flowers, we would jump up to 31. We'd get another 16 new flowers. Now, all of these flowers, for example, might be on these sort of elongated stems, but if we contracted all these stems, we're just going to pull them all in. I'm going to decrease the length of these stems to be almost nothing. We just end up with all these flowers coming in, surrounding sort of flower number 1. That is what's going on in these eucalypts. That's what I've been taught is what's going on. Now, whether I'm sort of wrong about that and I'm in fantasy lands, but that's what an older mentor taught me is what's going on. And I reckon it's really cool. So this might have been flower number 1, and that might have sort of developed a little bit earlier, and that produced the formation of flower 2 and flower 3. I'm just sort of, speculating here, but let's just say that's what's happened. And then flower number 2 here instigated these 2, and flower number 3 here instigated these 2. And then we might get more buds forming in between there, and we head up to 15. But that's just a typical appearance of what a 7-bud eucalypt looks like, a 7-bud umbellasta. This might have 7, and who knows what's going on here, maybe it's deformed. Of course, we use our common sense. Not every single one will have 7. You might see some with 6 or 5. And that's just because some might have fallen off, some might have been aborted, an insect might have eaten one, I don't know if a bird would have eaten one, but they might. A windy day might have snapped 2 of them off, who knows. But if you check representative samples over and over and over again, you'll see that most of them come out in 7s. The odd one might have 8, the odd one might have 10, the odd one might have 11, but sometimes to identify a species, we just look at these over and over and over again and go, well, look, most of them seem to have 7. So I've probably got a 7-budded eucalypt. So I reckon that's really cool, and I wanted to explain that. So if you want to call them umbels, well, maybe you can because some websites do, but really we call them umbellastas because they're not a true umbel. You've got flowers being produced on the backs of other flowers being produced, and an umbel doesn't do that, but an umbellasta does, or a condensed dichassia does. And I just think it's a really cool feature, really, really cool and mathematical. I'm just knocking off these images and I'm trying to reference them. They're not mine, and hopefully this is all fine. Here's an example, Eucalyptus alata. We'd have to count them, of course, but it's going up into the extreme level. It's moving into the 15 to 31 group. And if we just have a quick count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Yeah, it's really getting up there. This is one of the eucalypts that can push on to 30 flower buds per umbellasta. Can have a look at this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. One of the flowers is opened. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. You're getting up to, 18, 20, 25, and it can go on to 30 buds in the umbellasta. Along with the narrow leaves and the habitat and the appearance of the tree and the nice smell of those leaves, it's very peppermint. It's a beautiful identification feature. Eucalyptus alata, it's an easy one to identify, especially when you start finding these on the ground. And it's up in that 15, 20, 25 range, thinking that the maximum is probably 30, 31, based on that mathematical sequence we saw. So that's just an example of that. And here's beautiful Eucalyptus viminalis, or subspecies viminalis. You get these beautiful 3-bud umbellastas. Beautiful. Such a beautiful identification feature. If you want to be a bit of a lazy botanist, and I can be, I just look for these. If I think I've got Eucalyptus viminalis, I look for these and I go, yep, beautiful. And in the fruit, they continue. And they're just one of the eucalypts, or one of the taxa, I guess, that has 3 budded umbellastas. And that goes for eucs like Eucalyptus rubida a lot of the time, Eucalyptus longifolia, Eucalyptus dalrympliana, if you know those ones. Just those ones we get to know that have 3 buds. So hopefully you can see that feature playing out there. There's a lot of 3-budded ones. There's even more 7-budded ones. There's a lot of 7 to 15 budded Eucalypts. And then you got your 15 to 31, which they get a bit, they're a lot more rare. But I just wanted to point that out. So that's our inflorescence, that's our umbellasta. And you can see in Eucalyptus here, they're in the leaf axils. And we're going to talk, I think I'm going to cover that as well just before we end. Don't forget your resources. This is the New South Wales Flora Online Eucalyptus page. Tells you things like the fruit's a capsule. And then you can get these beautiful diagrams here, which are well worth having a look at. The flower bud, that's the outer calyptra. It might have an inner calyptra. So some Eucalypts and Corymbia, they can have 2 buds. Sorry, 2 bud caps. They can have 2 calyptrae. And again, you just assume that one of the calyptrae is a fusion of the flower sepals, and one of them is a fusion of the flower petals. When they have 1 calyptra, a lot of the time, there's sort of like a bud cap fused into another bud cap, and it just falls off as one piece. Sometimes you can look inside the bud cap, and I think this goes for some Corymbia, and you can see sort of 5 little petals stuck into the inside of the bud cap. It's stuck to the sort of top. I haven't spent a lot of time observing this, but it does get explained in the sort of Ken Hill and Laurie Johnson paper that you can look inside some of the bud caps, probably with a hand lens, and you can see 5 little petals sort of stuck in there. Really, really interesting, the sort of thing they throw up here. It's a bit of an internal diagram of the developing flower bud. The stamens are all packed in there. The hypanthium's here, the ovaries in there, and we're just waiting for this bud cap to fall off and all these stamens can pop out. And then we go to the fruiting stage. Fruit forms from flower bud B, and what's D? We've got a longitudinal section with calyptus shred as a single unit. Yeah. So sometimes that bud cap, this is more the case in Corymbia, where you got a real short bud cap, and it sometimes can get shed as a single unit. You got the fruit here. This is sort of the fruit here and the fruit here. In this particular euc, and this is a real typical red gum, something like Eucalyptus teraticornis maybe, we got these strongly exerted valves which are going to open and the seeds are going to be released. And in this particular fruit, the valves are inserted. They're below sort of the rim of the fruit, and they're down inside. And a lot of Corymbia do that. They have their valves well and truly inside. A lot of Eucalyptus can have their valves exerted and sort of sticking out, I guess. And that's some of the differences that we'll look at in the future slides, future presentations. So if we're sticking with Ken Hill and Laurie Johnson, and that's the case in New South Wales at the moment, and I'm sticking with that for now, pending further news, I guess. Angophora, it's a beautiful genus. You've only got to worry about 10 to 13 species. It's great. Depends on the lumpers and the splitters. Some splitters think these 10 species can be split into 13, and others think there's no difference between a couple of them, and we only have to worry about 10. They're only on the eastern mainland states. They're only in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. There's no Angophora in Western Australia, and there's no Angophora in Tasmania. They're only up and down the eastern coast, and they do get into the inland. They do get into the tablelands and the western slopes. Not too many species do that. And I reckon they're not intimidating at all, because you've only got to learn 10 to 13. You know, they're quite beautiful to learn about. Corymbia, about 115 or 95 species, depending on your lumping and your splitting. I think Dean Nicole's saying there's about 97 or something like that. About 110 are endemic to Australia. There's 5 species which occur in New Guinea, and there's one that's endemic to New Guinea. That's one of the things about Corymbia. They're a bit of a tropical, subtropical genus. And it is said by Ken Hill and Laurie Johnson in that 1995 paper that a lot of the Corymbia species are hard to sample and hard to get and hard to go to. I think you've got to sign up for some big field trips out into the interior of Australia and spend some serious time and money out there collecting. So there's a lot of Corymbia that are sort of hard to get to and hard to study. So that's just one thing about them. They're in all states and territories except Tasmania. No Corymbia were recognised in Tasmania. And we do remember, previously classified as Eucalyptus. So we always remember that sort of root, that's where they're from. They weren't Angophoras, they were Eucalyptus once upon a time. Only 10 species in New South Wales. You beauty, that's really good for me, someone like me. Don't have to get too confused. And a lot of those occur up the north coast of New South Wales. If I'm sort of south of Sydney or in line with Sydney, there's not too many I have to worry about, but there are still some beautiful ones to learn. Eucalyptus, anywhere between 700 and 950 species. Holy dooly, whatever you want to say. A lot of people say there's about 800. At any one time, I think we've got about 50 eucalypts which are not formally identified, but that people are recognising as being a distinct entity. And we have had some new eucalypts recognised recently. A good one in Sydney is Eucalyptus cryptica, which has just been recognised. Eucalyptus, you might not know, they're found as far as the Philippines. There's some eucalypts naturally occurring there. Through Indonesia, Timor, New Guinea, into Australia, only about 16 species occur outside of Australia. And like I said, there are fossils in New Zealand, but there's no current species found there naturally. Really, really interesting. All states and territories, including Tasmania. So Tasmania has a fair few as well this time. So that's your eucalyptus distribution. We just go into some features that are going to be repeated in future presentations when we separate these genera out. You might have observed in eucalypts we can have some really big differences between what we call the juvenile leaves or the early foliage coming out of the branches, such as epicormic buds and seedlings and that sort of thing. And then we move to our adult stage. So a lot of the taxa can have what we call heterophyly, where you have very different juvenile leaves versus adult leaves. And there's a lot of plants that do this, but the eucalyptus do it pretty commonly. Some species, there doesn't seem to be any difference between the juvenile leaves and the adult leaves, or if there is, the juvenile leaves aren't produced in a very big sort of array or in very big sort of shoots, I guess, and you get the adult leaves emerging pretty quickly. One tree I can think about is this sort of Corymbia eximia. When you've got a sapling, the leaves look just like the adult leaves. So I don't think they do much of a job in producing juvenile leaves, but we sort of separate out the juvenile and the adult foliage on a lot of species because the juvenile foliage can be very useful for identification as well. In Angophora and Corymbia and Eucalyptus, the juvenile leaves are pretty much always opposite, and there can be a range of variety, there can be a lot of variety in how quickly that juvenile foliage moves to being alternate or disjunct. In Angophora, the adult foliage tends to remain opposite or subopposite, and in Corymbia and Eucalyptus, it tends to go alternate disjunct very quickly, or at least eventually. And it's a huge difference between the separating out Angophora from Corymbia Eucalyptus. They have the conspicuously staminate flowers, but like I said, it's Corymbia and Eucalyptus that have the bud cap. sometimes 2 bud caps, Calyptrae, opercula, and in Angophora you've got the petals and the sepals that continue to surround the one carpel. There's no Calyptra. But if some of those Corymbia species get moved into Angophora, like Dean Nicole is flagging, then I assume this sort of goes out the window. I assume we're going to have Angophora that have bud caps. That's what I'm assuming. We'll see what happens. The capsules of Angophora, or the fruit, they've got these conspicuous longitudinal ribs, and we're going to look at that in the next presentation. And they've got these teeth at the opening. They're sort of like these sepal projections. They've got these really conspicuous teeth, and it makes the Angophora fruit look like this sort of fancy wine goblet. We're going to look at that as well. Corymbia tend to lack the longitudinal ribs, or if they can have longitudinal lines, but they tend to sort of lack the raised ribs. And they can have a sunken disc, or they tend to have a sunken disc with deeply inserted or enclosed valves. They're typically urn-shaped, and they can sometimes have these longitudinal lines. But look for the sunken disc, look for the enclosed valves. We're going to look at that in the next, in the presentation on Corymbia. Eucalyptus, remember we've got, let's say, 800 species. You get a massive variety. They're rarely urn-shaped, though they can be. They can have a level disc, a sunken disc, or a raised disc. And they can have the valves inserted, rim level, slightly to strongly exerted. They can have the whole box and dice. So they differ a fair bit to these guys. Normally Corymbia have these very distinctive looking fruit, which we can sort of latch onto. Eucalypts, they can be a bit confusing when it comes to their fruit. There's just such a variety. Remember what Dean Nicole said about difficulty in discerning genera or differentiating genera. But these are some of the not completely concrete but really helpful things that we latch onto. We've got inflorescences and we've got bark. In Angophora, they also get called umbellasters, and they're typically in terminal clusters, and they're sort of putting these terminal clusters beyond the foliage. So the Angophoras put their flowers right out there on the terminals, as if to say to the insects and the flying foxes and the possums, you know, come and get me right out here. Corymbia tend to do a similar thing to Angophora. This is where there's a bit of linkage here. Typically grouped in terminal clusters beyond the foliage. So Corymbia put their flowers right out there at the terminals, beyond the foliage where they're easily seen. And so what it means is when you've got an Angophora tree flowering and when you've got a Corymbia tree flowering, they look like they're covered in flowers because the flowers are right out there, like these sort of cauliflowered looking structures on the ends of the foliage. And a lot of Corymbia, they tend to group their flowers into, you know, a sort of inflorescence called a corym. And that's where that word Corymbia comes from. These corym inflorescences. Eucalyptus, they have umbellasters as well, and they're sometimes in terminal clusters, but they're often in the leaf axils. They're down in amongst the foliage. And those umbellasters can be solitary in the leaf axils, like that 7-budded umbellaster we were looking at earlier on. Or they can put them in sort of pairs or clusters, sort of like in scribbly gums. You see them putting them in these sort of, maybe these sort of raceme-like groups. But a lot of the times the umbellasters are solitary. Where in Angophora and Corymbia, they tend to put into these branch sort of structures. So you can see this term come up called a conflorescence, where you've got flower buds put in an umbellaster, and then those umbellasters are sort of arranged in these sort of branch-like structures where you've got secondary arrangements of flowers, or secondary arrangements of umbellasters anyway. That's what we call a conflorescence, where you've got inflorescences of inflorescences, and wattles do this as well. It's sort of secondary arranging of flowers. a secondary level arrangement. We can look at that in more detail. But sometimes your Eucalyptus umbellasters, they're just on their own. They're just on their own in the leaf axils. Or they can be in pairs. If you ever look at a Eucalypt called Eucalyptus fastigata, that's really easily identifiable because it puts its umbellasters in pairs in the leaf axils. Hardly any other Eucalypt does that. It's a really cool identifying feature. Or they can put them in these, you know, extended clusters where they're trying to create like a sort of raceme of umbellasters, if you like. Hopefully that wasn't too complicated. We'll go through it in more detail. The bark's a good one. In Angophora, you can have trees that are all smooth bark, or they can be full fibrous crumbly bark. In Corymbia, you can have smooth barks, like a gum, full fibrous barks, or you can have part barks. You can have these really distinctive Corymbias where they've got a sock or a half trunk of really fibrous bark, and then they'll go smooth after that. Thinking of something like Corymbia torrelliana, or might be Corymbia tychocarpa, or one of those. It's really distinctive. And again, remember Eucalypts, there's so much variety, so many species. We get full bark, stringy bark, iron bark, part bark, or smooth bark, and everything in between. And we'll be looking at that in more detail too. So I guess it's easy to just remember with Angophora they're either all smooth bark or full fibrous. There's no iron bark in Angophora. There's no part bark. They're either one or the other. And Corymbia are sort of moving into more variety with Eucalyptus. There's some very good resources. Euclid, New South Wales Flora Online, PlantNet, Ian Brooker, his Eucalyptus book. Australian Native Plant Society, they got a very good explanatory page as well, which is really cool. They're some of the best resources. A lot of the time now, I just go to Euclid. I consider it a bit of a Bible, I guess, if that's not a bad term. And what I like about Euclid is they tend to be lumping a lot more species, and I sort of like that. I think that's good. I'll just quickly explain to you some of the work I've done, just for a bit of interest. I was collecting Eucalypt samples for the Botanic Gardens, the genetic boffins, so they could extract DNA out of them and look at the DNA in more detail, again, possibly with a view of lumping and splitting species. My mission would be, as an example, would be something like this. They'd give me endless maps like this, and they just wanted these species collected from anywhere within these sort of arbitrary circles across New South Wales. Here's Bathurst, here's Orange, I think that's Mudgee up there. Just go to these circles, Dan, pick whatever bushland you want, you can get access to, and collect these species as efficiently as possible. And it's just one of the experiences I've had over about a year or two, or maybe 3 years. Driving out, getting as many of these as I can in areas where I can as quickly as possible. And I guess what I'd point out is you spend a lot of time on websites like this, the New South Wales Wildlife Atlas, Bionet. And this is just an example of a search for Eucalyptus melliodora, yellow box. So everyone's uploading their records, people who are collecting, people who are doing ecology, botanists, uploading their records to Bionet. And we get a very good view eventually of where Eucalyptus melliodora is going to be found. For example, if I'm along the coast, very hard to find. If I'm inland, it gets a fair bit easier. You can zoom in, and here's all the records around Bathurst, for example. So all I'm saying is, if you're doing a survey out here somewhere, and you might be still learning your Eucalypts, and you might be thinking, you know what, I think I'm getting Eucalyptus melliodora. I'm not too sure, I don't know it too well, but I think I'm getting it. Well, if you have a look at Bionet, and you were working here to the west of Bathurst, but very close to Bathurst, well, it's highly likely you were getting Eucalyptus melliodora. Might be a bit weird if you didn't get it. very common tree in this part of the world. But all I say is think of the converse, where you might think you're getting Eucalyptus melliodora, but there's absolutely no red triangles on Bionet where you were working. And you might just start to think, well, maybe I wasn't getting Eucalyptus melliodora because there's no records here. This is sort of the converse, but just think about that. These are ecological survey records. They're botanical botanist records. They're, the average sort of bushwalker amateur, if they choose, can also upload records. So they're not perfect and they're not correct all the time. But eventually you just get a pattern of where people have recorded Eucalyptus melliodora. And it's very, very, very helpful. I don't know how I would have done that eucalyptus collecting work without this. Like if I was doing it before the internet, I just would have had to drive the roads and pretty much use my eyes, which I do, of course, but it would have been a lot more time consuming. On PlantNet, and this is the page, New South Wales Flora Online, this is the page for Eucalyptus melliodora. You can see they've got a similar map here. But this is herbarium records only. So these records have been backed up by a herbarium specimen lodged and databased in a herbarium. So it's a bit more powerful than Bionet. It's had a herbarium specimen identified and lodged to back up the record. So all of these guys sit in Australian herbaria somewhere. And if I bring up this map, this is the Australasian Virtual Herbarium, and these are the records of herbarium specimens that are lodged in Australian and possibly other herbaria as well. So you can click on these, you can look where the botanist collected it, and you can look at sort of the details of the specimen that's been lodged. So it's very helpful, and it just carries a bit more power than Bionet, although I rely on both. So you might not be familiar with that one, but do use that Australasian Virtual Herbarium. You can see if there's any historic herbarium specimens nearby where you're working for any particular species that you might be interested in. And again, if no one's collected a herbarium specimen maybe within 50 kilometers of where you're working, then it just might move into the probability that you might have misidentified it. But it can just depend. You might have found an extension of range or something like that. So that is it for that presentation. It has gone a lot longer than the last one, but hopefully you've enjoyed it just as much, and I've whacked a lot more information on there. I'll have a look at the Angophora one and the Corymbia one. Possibly won't do it again because I think those ones are okay. But I do have the Eucalypt ones to upload and I need to get cracking on those. So hopefully this was very helpful for you, and look forward to engaging with you again. Thanks guys. Thanks for tuning in.